There's a quiet moment most people experience, usually late at night or early in the morning, when the noise dies down and honesty creeps in. It's the moment you admit to yourself that something isn't moving. Not outside, inside. You've tried to stay hopeful. You've told yourself to be patient. You've waited for the sign, the breakthrough, the shift that proves things are finally changing, and yet, day after day, life seems to repeat itself in slightly different forms. Not worse, just the same. And what makes it harder is that you're not lazy, you're not careless, you're not unaware. You want more clarity, more stability, more freedom, more alignment. But wanting hasn't been enough. That's not a personal failure. It's a misunderstanding of how change actually works. Most people believe life moves first and they follow. They think circumstances lead and identity reacts. They wait for confidence to arrive before acting confident. They wait for security before relaxing. They wait for proof before trusting. But reality doesn't respond to waiting. It responds to position. Your life right now is not a reflection of your hopes. It's a reflection of where you're living from, the way you speak to yourself when no one's listening, the assumptions you carry without realizing it, the quiet expectations you've normalized as just being realistic. You don't experience what you desire, you experience what you assume is true. This audiobook isn't here to hype you up or convince you to believe something you don't feel. It's not about forcing optimism or pretending everything is fine. And it's definitely not about chasing outcomes harder. It's about something far simpler and far more confronting. It's about noticing the end you're already living from. Whether you realize it or not, you're already acting as if something is done. You're just not conscious of what that something is. Some people live as if success is unlikely. Some live as if love always fades. Some live as if peace comes later, never now. And life, quietly and faithfully, follows, not to punish, not to reward, but to confirm. Reality is remarkably neutral. It doesn't argue with your beliefs. It organizes itself around them. That's why effort without inner movement feels exhausting. You're trying to push against a conclusion you're still standing in. This audiobook invites you to stop pushing and start repositioning. To understand that change doesn't begin when circumstances shift, and it begins when you do. When you stop asking, when will this happen? And start asking, where am I living from right now? Because when you move internally, something subtle but powerful happens. Your decisions change without force. Your reactions soften. Your timing improves. Your standards quietly rise. Not because you're trying to be different, but because you are. Living from the end doesn't mean denying your current reality. It means understanding that your current reality is already delayed feedback. It's yesterday's state showing up today. And once you see that, urgency fades. Desperation loosens. You stop checking the mirror every 5 minutes to see if something changed. You know it will, because you've already moved. This is not about magic. It's about alignment. When your inner position changes, the outer world has no choice but to adjust, slowly, naturally, inevitably. So as you listen, don't rush to apply anything. Don't turn this into another task or technique. Just notice yourself. Notice where you expect life to go wrong. Notice where you're still waiting for permission. Notice how often you postpone your own certainty. Because awareness is the doorway. And once you step through it, there's no going back to unconscious living. If this message speaks to you, don't keep it private. Share this video with one person you know who truly needs it right now. Someone who's tired of waiting, ready to shift, and serious about improving their life. Sometimes, the right message at the right time changes everything. Chapter 1. You are always living from an end. You may believe you're undecided about your future. You may think you're still figuring things out. But the truth is simpler and more confronting than that. You are never neutral. Every day, in every situation, you are living from an end, an assumed outcome, a quiet conclusion about how things usually go for you. You don't announce it, you don't write it down, but you live from it. It shows up in the smallest moments. When an opportunity appears and your first instinct is to hesitate. When someone compliments you and you downplay it. When a door opens and you instinctively look for why it might close again. Those reactions don't come from logic. They come from an end you've already accepted as familiar. Most people think an end is something dramatic. Success, failure, wealth, loss. But most ends are subtle. They feel reasonable. They sound like realism. This probably won't last. I've seen how this goes before. People like me don't usually get that. And because those thoughts feel calm and familiar, they go unquestioned. But life doesn't respond to what feels logical. It responds to what feels settled inside you. There's a difference between what you say you want and what you expect. Expectation is quiet. It doesn't argue. It simply assumes. And assumption is powerful. Think of someone who assumes conversations never quite go their way. They don't think of themselves as socially anxious. They just expect to be misunderstood. So they over-explain. They soften their opinions. They adjust their tone before anyone reacts. By the end of the conversation, they feel unseen again. This is not because others intended it, but because they lived from an end where being unseen was already normal. Reality didn't cause the experience. It confirmed it. There was a woman who wanted to change careers. She spent years talking about it. She read articles, listened to podcasts, imagined a different life. But whenever someone asked her a simple question, "So when are you making the move?" she laughed it off. "Maybe someday. I'm not quite there yet. I just need more time." What she didn't realize was that she wasn't waiting for clarity. She was living from an end where staying put felt safer than moving forward. So time passed and nothing changed. Not because she lacked talent, but because her inner conclusion hadn't shifted. Your actions don't reveal what you want. They reveal what you assume is realistic. An assumption always wins. You can't act your way into a new end if you're still standing in the old one. You'll sabotage without realizing it. Delay without noticing. Second guess at the exact moment momentum appears. Not out of fear, but out of familiarity. The mind prefers what it knows over what it desires. That's why repeating affirmations without changing position feels empty. You're saying new words from an old place, and life can feel the mismatch. This chapter isn't about changing your assumptions yet. It's about seeing them clearly. Because most people try to build a new future while standing in an old conclusion, and then wonder why everything feels heavy. Ask yourself something gently, but honestly. When you think about the area of your life that feels stuck, what outcome do you quietly expect? Not what you hope for, not what you wish would happen. What you expect when you're tired, when you're alone, when no one is watching. That expectation is the end you're living from, and it doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Most of these ends were formed slowly, through repetition, disappointment, observation. You didn't choose them consciously, but you've been loyal to them ever since. Here's the part most people miss. You don't need to fight the old end. You don't need to prove it wrong. You don't need to shame yourself for having it. You just need to recognize it. Because awareness creates distance, and distance creates choice. Once you see the end you're living from, something subtle happens. You stop identifying with it. You stop calling it who you are. It becomes a position, not your identity. And positions can change. And this is where real transformation begins. Not with effort, not with forcing confidence, but with clarity. When you see clearly where you're standing, you can choose where to stand next. And that choice, quiet, internal, almost invisible, is the first moment reality begins to shift. Not yet on the outside, but at the source. And from there, everything else follows. Chapter 2. Wanting keeps you out of the end. There is a reason wanting feels exhausting, because wanting places you outside the very thing you're reaching for. It sounds harmless at first, even responsible. I want to be more confident. I want things to change. I want a better situation. But hidden inside that language is a quiet statement. This is not mine yet. And the moment you live from that position, you confirm separation. Wanting is not neutral. It's a state where your attention stays fixed on absence, where your energy leans forward, chasing a future that never quite arrives. This is why so many people feel like they're almost there. Always preparing, always learning, always improving, but never arriving. There was a man who wanted to feel financially secure. He tracked every expense, read about investing, listened to mindset talks on money every day. From the outside, he looked disciplined, focused, committed. But inside, his relationship with money was tense. Every decision felt heavy. Every purchase came with anxiety. He was living from an end where security was fragile. Something to protect, not something to embody. So no matter how much he earned, relief never came. The numbers changed. The state didn't. That's the trap of wanting. It convinces you that movement equals progress, that effort equals alignment, that thinking about something long enough will eventually pull it closer. But wanting is still waiting, just dressed up as action. The moment you say, "I want," you position yourself as someone who doesn't have, and life responds accordingly, not because it's cruel, but because it's precise. Reality doesn't respond to your enthusiasm. It responds to your position. Being, on the other hand, is quiet. It doesn't chase. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need reassurance. Being is when your behavior no longer negotiates with the outcome. Think about someone who is calm. They don't tell themselves to relax every 5 minutes. They don't check to see if calmness is working. They simply move through situations with less resistance. The same applies to every area of life. When you are something, you don't constantly ask if it's happening. You don't scan for evidence. You don't explain yourself. You live from it. This is why wanting can quietly sabotage manifestation. Not because desire is wrong, but because desire without repositioning keeps you outside the end. Many people are afraid of being because being feels like commitment, and commitment feels risky. If you fully live as if it's done and it doesn't work out, what then? So instead, you stay in wanting. It feels safer. There's less to lose, but safety comes at a cost. Wanting stretches time. It keeps the finish line just far enough away to justify staying where you are. There was a woman who wanted a healthier relationship. She knew her patterns. She journaled about boundaries. She promised herself she'd choose differently next time. But when she met someone new, she slipped back into overgiving, over-explaining, over-adjusting. Why? Because she wasn't living from the end of being valued. She was living from the end of hoping to be. So her behavior asked for validation instead of assuming it, and people responded to that. This is where most teachings stop short. They tell you what to want, but not how to stop wanting. The shift doesn't happen when you suppress desire. It happens when you stop using desire as a substitute for position. You don't need to want harder. You need to move, not externally, internally. To live from the end doesn't mean you pretend the desire never existed. It means you no longer relate to it as missing. You stop leaning toward the future for permission to be who you are now. This doesn't mean everything changes overnight, but you do. Your tone changes. Your decisions simplify. Your reactions soften. You stop performing for results. And that's when things begin to reorganize. Wanting keeps you watching the door. Being opens it. And once you step through, Don't you realize something quietly powerful? The effort you thought you needed was never the answer. The position always was. You don't need to convince life. You need to align with it. And alignment begins the moment you stop asking, "When will this happen?" and start living as if the question is already answered. Chapter 3. The state comes before the evidence. One of the most common mistakes people make is believing that evidence creates certainty. They think confidence appears after results, that calm comes after stability, that trust is earned after proof. But that order is backwards. Evidence doesn't create your state. Your state creates the evidence. A state is not a mood. It's not how you feel on a good day versus a bad one. A state is the emotional and mental position you return to when nothing is happening. It's how you relate to life when there's no immediate feedback. Someone living in a state of trust moves differently than someone living in a state of doubt. Even if their circumstances look identical, they respond instead of react. They pause instead of panic. They decide instead of waiting. And those differences compound. There was a man who was constantly checking his phone. Every few minutes he refreshed emails, messages, notifications. Not because anything urgent was happening, but because he lived in a state of anticipation mixed with anxiety. Something needed to arrive. Something needed to confirm that things were moving. Nothing ever felt settled. Contrast that with someone who checks once or twice and then moves on with their day. Same situation, same uncertainty, different state. The second person isn't careless. They're grounded. They're living from an assumption that things will work themselves out, or at least that they'll handle whatever comes. And life responds to that steadiness. Reality doesn't rush to reassure someone who's constantly asking for reassurance. It waits, but it aligns quickly with someone who's already settled internally. This is why forcing belief rarely works. You can repeat the right words and still live from the wrong state. You can say everything is fine while bracing for impact. Life feels the brace, not the words. The state always leaks through. Think about how children sense when an adult is pretending to be calm. The tone might be soft, but the tension is obvious. Reality works the same way. It doesn't listen to what you say you believe. It responds to what you're resting in. Many people delay living fully because they're waiting for certainty. They tell themselves, "Once I know for sure, I'll relax. Once this works out, I'll feel safe." But safety is not a reward. It's a position. When you wait for evidence before settling into a new state, you trap yourself in a loop. The state waits for proof. The proof waits for the state. Nothing moves. There was a woman who wanted to feel at peace in her daily life. She believed peace would come once her schedule cleared, once her finances improved, once her relationship stabilized. So she stayed tense, alert, on edge. Years passed. Eventually she got tired, not of her circumstances, but of the constant inner resistance. She stopped negotiating with the future. She began to move through her days with less urgency. She stopped overmanaging outcomes. She chose to respond instead of brace. Nothing dramatic changed at first, but slowly her world softened. Conversations improved, decisions became easier, opportunities appeared without force. Peace didn't arrive because life changed. Life changed because peace arrived first. This is difficult to accept because it removes the excuse of waiting. It means you don't get to say, "I'll feel different when things improve." You feel different and things improve as a result. This doesn't mean ignoring problems. It means refusing to let them dictate your inner position. The state you live in is like a filter. It determines what you notice, how you interpret events, and what you allow yourself to act on. When the state changes, your perception changes, and when perception changes, behavior follows. Not forced, not rehearsed, naturally. Living from the end is not about predicting outcomes. it's about stabilizing your inner environment. When your inner world stops oscillating with every external shift, the outer world begins to reorganize. Quietly, gradually, reliably. You don't need to hunt for evidence, so you don't need to monitor progress obsessively. Those behaviors belong to the old state. A settled state doesn't rush. It doesn't demand proof. It moves forward because movement feels appropriate, not desperate. And once you understand this, something clicks. You stop asking, why hasn't it happened yet? And start noticing, I'm no longer living like it hasn't. That is the moment reality begins to catch up. Chapter 4. Stop preparing. Start occupying. At some point, preparation becomes resistance. It looks productive. It sounds responsible. But underneath, it's still avoidance. You tell yourself you're not ready yet. You just need more information, more confidence, more clarity. So you prepare. You read another book. You wait for better timing. You promise yourself you'll move once things feel more stable. But stability never arrives first. Occupation does. Preparation belongs to the mindset of someone who plans to enter a room. Occupation belongs to someone who's already inside, and life responds very differently to each. There was a man who dreamed of speaking confidently in public. He watched countless videos on communication. He practiced in his head. He waited until he felt natural enough. Years passed. One day, the circumstances forced him to speak up. Not because he was ready, but because silence was no longer an option. And something surprising happened. He wasn't perfect. He stumbled, but his voice didn't shake the way he feared. Why? Because for that moment, he wasn't preparing to be confident. He was occupying the role. Occupation bypasses hesitation. When you occupy a position, you stop asking permission. You stop checking if it's allowed. You move as someone for whom this is already normal. Preparation keeps you watching yourself. Occupation lets you forget yourself. This is why people stay stuck in self-improvement loops. They're constantly becoming, but never arriving. They confuse readiness with readiness signals, but the signals only come after occupation. Think about someone learning to drive. So no amount of studying replaces sitting behind the wheel. The confidence doesn't come first, the seat does. Life works the same way. You don't become something and then step in. You step in and become. Preparation keeps your identity flexible. Occupation solidifies it. This is where fear usually speaks up. What if I occupy the wrong role? What if I act too soon? What if I look foolish? Those questions don't come from intuition. They come from attachment to the old position, because once you occupy a new state, going back feels uncomfortable. Preparation lets you keep one foot in each world. Occupation requires commitment. There was a woman who wanted to be treated with more respect. She read about boundaries. She practiced saying no in her mind. She promised herself she'd speak up next time. But when the moment came, she softened again. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she hadn't occupied the identity yet. Eventually, something shifted. Not her words, but her posture. She stopped rehearsing responses. She responded simply, "No, that doesn't work for me." No explanation, no justification, and the world adjusted, not instantly, but noticeably. Occupation sends a clearer signal than effort ever could. When you occupy a state, your nervous system reorganizes. Your tone changes. Your timing sharpens. Your decisions simplify. You stop managing impressions. You start living from alignment. This doesn't mean being reckless. It means being congruent. You don't occupy by pretending. You occupy by acting in ways that feel obvious from that position. Ask yourself this quietly. If this were already done, how would I move today? Or what would I stop postponing? What would I no longer tolerate? Those answers are not dramatic. They're usually subtle, and subtle shifts are the most powerful ones. You don't need to announce your new position. You don't need to convince anyone. Occupation is felt, not explained. The moment you stop preparing and start occupying, something changes. Not outside first, but inside. And once that shift stabilizes, the outer world has no choice but to respond. Preparation waits for reality. Occupation lets reality catch up. And that's where momentum is born. There is a subtle difference between acting from a position and acting toward it. Most people never notice it, but life does. When you act towards something, there is tension underneath your movements. You're trying to arrive. You're monitoring yourself. You're watching for reactions. When you act from a position, there is no performance, no self-checking, no inner commentary. That absence of tension is not accidental. It's a signal. Reality reads signals far more clearly than intentions. You can feel this difference in everyday situations. Imagine walking into a room where you feel you belong. You don't rush. You don't scan faces. You don't adjust your posture to fit in. Now imagine entering a room where you feel you have to prove yourself. Your body tightens. Your awareness splits. You become aware of yourself being seen. Both rooms may look identical. The difference is internal. And the internal difference always produces different outcomes. This is why occupying a state changes results without visible effort. Your body language shifts before you even realize it. Your voice slows. Your responses become simpler. You stop overloading conversations with explanations. You trust that what you say is enough. That trust is not arrogance, it's stability. There was someone who used to overthink every message before sending it. They reread texts. They edited tone. They worried about how they'd be perceived. One day, after a quiet inner shift, they stopped doing that. Not because they learned a new technique, but because they no longer felt the need to manage the outcome. They occupied a different position. I am already understood. And the conversations changed. People responded more clearly. Misunderstandings decreased. Connections deepened. Not magically, but mechanically. When you stop acting toward approval, you stop inviting confusion. Occupation removes mixed signals. Another overlooked aspect of occupation is patience. Not the passive kind, but the grounded kind. When you're occupying a state, you don't rush results. You're no longer checking the clock to see if something is working. Time stops feeling like an enemy. This is crucial because impatience always reveals a hidden doubt. It signals that you're still leaning forward, waiting for confirmation. Occupation leans back. It allows space, and space is where reorganization happens. Many people mistake urgency for commitment, but urgency is often fear wearing productivity's clothes. Commitment is calm. It's the steady refusal to abandon a position just because nothing visible has happened yet. This is why occupying the end requires restraint. Not action, but consistency. Consistency in how you respond. Consistency in how you choose. Consistency in what you no longer negotiate with. You don't need to force new habits immediately. You need to stop contradicting the position you've chosen. Every time you react from the old state, you reinforce it. Every time you pause and respond from the new one, you strengthen it. And slowly, something stabilizes. The need to prepare fades. The urge to explain dissolves. The compulsion to check for signs weakens. What replaces it is quiet certainty, not excitement, not anticipation. Certainty. And certainty doesn't chase outcomes. It allows them. When you live from that place long enough, life stops testing you. It stops pushing back, because there's nothing left to negotiate. Occupation is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. But it's unmistakable. And once you're there, you realize something simple and profound. You were never meant to prepare for the life you want. You were meant to step into it, and from that step, everything else unfolds naturally. Chapter 5. Identity moves. Reality, not effort. Most people believe effort is what changes life. They think if they try harder, push longer, stay disciplined enough, reality will eventually give in. But effort is not what moves reality. Identity does. Effort is what you use when you don't fully trust who you are, being yet. It's the energy of compensation, of proving, of forcing movement from a place of doubt. Identity, on the other hand, doesn't push. It pulls. You can always tell which one you're operating from by how tired you feel afterward. Effort drains. Identity stabilizes. When something comes from identity, it doesn't feel heroic. It feels normal, almost boring. That's exactly why it works. Think about how you do things that already feel like you. You don't psych yourself up. You don't overthink. You don't ask for permission. You simply act. That's identity in motion. Now compare that to something you desperately want, but don't yet see as natural. You plan, you rehearse, you motivate yourself, you question your timing. Same person, different identity, and life responds to the difference immediately. There was a man who wanted to be seen as capable at work. He stayed late. He volunteered for extra tasks. He tried to prove his value through effort. But the harder he worked, the more invisible he felt. Why? Because internally, he still identified as someone trying to earn his place. So his behavior came with subtle signals of insecurity, over-explaining, over-delivering, waiting for validation. Eventually, something shifted. Not his workload, his self-concept. He stopped seeing himself as someone who needed to be noticed, and he began to see himself as someone whose presence already mattered. He spoke less. He chose his moments. He stopped rushing to respond. And without increasing effort, his influence grew. Not because people suddenly became nicer, but because identity communicates before words do. You don't convince reality of who you are. You demonstrate it by how naturally you move. This is why so many people burn out on self-improvement. They're stacking techniques on top of an unchanged identity. They try to think differently while still seeing themselves the same way. They try to act confident while still identifying as uncertain. They try to attract abundance while still identifying as someone who lacks. The contradiction creates friction, and friction always feels like effort. Identity doesn't require motivation. It requires acceptance. Not acceptance of limitation, but acceptance of position. When you accept a new identity, you stop arguing with yourself. You stop negotiating. You stop asking, "Am I allowed to be this way?" You simply are. There was a woman who struggled with boundaries. She knew what healthy boundaries looked like. She read about them. She understood them intellectually. But in practice, she kept overgiving. Why? Because her identity was still anchored to being the understanding one, the one who adapts, the one who doesn't rock the boat. No amount of effort could override that. One day, after a quiet internal realization, she stopped trying to set boundaries. She began to be someone who respected herself. Her responses shortened. Her explanations disappeared. Her tone changed, not sharp, not defensive, just settled. People adjusted, not because she demanded it, but because identity sets expectations automatically. This is the part that feels uncomfortable to hear. Reality does not respond to how badly you want something. It responds to who you believe yourself to be. Effort is loud. Identity is silent, and silence carries authority. When identity shifts, behavior follows without force. You don't wake up and say, "Today I will act like a confident person." You simply act, and when you do slip back into old patterns, you notice it quickly. Not with shame, but with clarity. That's not me anymore. That sentence, when it's true, is powerful. Identity is not built through repetition alone. It's built through decision, a decision so internal it doesn't need witnesses. You decide what kind of person you are willing to be consistent as, and then you refuse to contradict it. This doesn't mean perfection. It means alignment. You don't correct every mistake. You correct the direction. The moment identity changes, effort changes shape. It becomes focused instead of frantic, intentional instead of desperate. You still act, you still move, but you're no longer chasing an outcome. You're expressing who you already are, and life recognizes that immediately. This is why living from the end works. Not as a trick, but as a law. When you live from the end, you're not visualizing success. You're occupying the identity of someone for whom that success is natural. You don't ask, how do I get there? You ask, how would someone who's already there move today? And the answers are rarely dramatic. They're often quieter, simpler, more grounded. Identity doesn't rush. It doesn't perform. It doesn't overcorrect. It trusts itself. There's a calm that comes with identity-based living that no amount of effort can replicate. A steadiness that doesn't depend on results. And that steadiness is magnetic. Because life is drawn to what's stable. This is why trying to manifest through force fails. Force implies resistance. Identity implies inevitability. You don't force what already feels true. And when something feels true long enough, it becomes visible. Not because you pushed it into existence, but because you stopped pushing against it. At some point, you realize the work was never about becoming someone new. It was about releasing the identity that no longer fits, letting go of who you were taught to be, who you adapted into, who you survived as, and choosing quietly, firmly, to live as someone else. Someone calmer, someone clearer, someone more aligned. That choice doesn't require permission. It requires consistency. And once identity and behavior stop contradicting each other, reality no longer hesitates. It moves, not instantly, not dramatically, but reliably. Because identity always leads, and life always follows. Chapter 6. Time delay is not failure. One of the quickest ways people abandon a new identity is misunderstanding time. They assume that if reality hasn't changed yet, then nothing is working. They mistake silence for rejection, delay for denial. But delay is neither. Delay is simply the distance between a shift inside and its reflection outside. Every meaningful change has a lag. Not because reality resists you, but because reality reorganizes in layers. The problem is not the delay. The problem is how you interpret it. Most people see delay and immediately regress. They check for signs, they question themselves, they start negotiating with the old identity again. And without realizing it, they step back into the very position they meant to leave. There was someone who decided to live with more self-respect, and they stopped over-explaining, stopped chasing responses, stopped lowering their standards to keep things smooth. For a while, nothing changed. In fact, things felt worse. Old dynamics didn't immediately adjust. People tested boundaries. Silence replaced validation, and doubt crept in. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'm being unrealistic. Maybe this isn't who I really am. That moment is where most people undo the work, not because the new position is wrong, but because the delay exposes attachment. Delay asks a simple question: can you stay where you are without proof? Living from the end means you don't collapse back into the old state just because the mirror hasn't caught up yet. Because mirrors always lag. Think about turning a large ship at sea. The wheel moves first. The ship follows slowly. And if you panic during the turn and spin the wheel back, the ship never changes direction. Most people do this internally all the time. They shift identity, then check reality. When reality hasn't responded yet, they assume failure, so they revert, and life faithfully returns to the old course. Delay is not punishment, It's stabilization. It gives your nervous system time to adjust. It tests whether the new identity is real or temporary. There was a man who decided to stop living in constant urgency. He had always rushed, overcommitted, and reacted immediately to everything. When he chose calm, the world didn't reward him right away. Emails still came, deadlines still existed, people still expected instant responses. But he didn't return to urgency. He paused before replying. He chose fewer commitments. He allowed space. And at first, it felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible. But then something subtle happened. Others adjusted their expectations. Emergencies decreased. His decisions improved. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because he stopped feeding the old pattern. Delay was the transition. Most people think consistency means repeating actions, but consistency is really about maintaining position. You don't need to do more during the delay. You need to stop doing what contradicts who you've chosen to be. Delay reveals whether your identity is conditional. If your calm depends on outcomes, it's not calm. If your confidence depends on validation, it's not confidence. If your certainty depends on signs, it's not certainty. Living from the end means you remain steady even when nothing seems to be happening, especially then. This is where impatience usually appears. Impatience isn't a personality trait. It's a signal. It signals that part of you is still leaning forward, waiting for reality to confirm your position. But confirmation doesn't come to those who wait for it. It comes to those who no longer need it. There's a quiet power in staying put, in not explaining, in not correcting appearances, in not trying to speed things up. That stillness communicates something stronger than effort ever could. It says, "This is who I am now," and life listens. Delay also filters relationships, situations, and opportunities. Things aligned with the old identity often fall away first, not because you failed, but because they no longer fit. This can feel like loss, but it's actually clearance. Space being made. If you rush to fill it out of discomfort, so you cancel the process. Delay teaches restraint, and restraint stabilizes identity. Eventually, without announcement, movement begins again. Not as a breakthrough, as a continuation. A conversation shifts, a decision lands, an opportunity appears that matches your new position. And when it does, it feels normal, not shocking, not miraculous, expected. That's how you know the work was real. You don't celebrate proof. You recognize it, because you've already been living from that end. Time delay was never the enemy. It was the bridge. And once you understand that, you stop rushing across it. You walk, steady, unbothered, certain. And the world, as always, follows. Chapter 7. Live as if. Without tension. The moment most people hear "live as if," they misunderstand it. They think it means pretending, acting confident when you're not, forcing optimism, putting on a performance strong enough to convince life to cooperate. That misunderstanding creates tension. And tension is the clearest sign you are not living from the end. Living as if is not about effort. It's about relaxation into a position. When you are truly living from the end, your body knows it first. There is less urgency in your movements, less explaining in your words, less mental rehearsal before you act. Tension disappears when something feels settled. Think about something you already feel secure in. You don't think about it constantly. You don't check it for reassurance. You don't wonder if it's going to vanish tomorrow. That ease is not accidental. It's the emotional signature of something you assume is done. Now compare that to something you want badly. Notice the tightness, the constant checking, the internal dialogue that never turns off. That's not desire. That's resistance. And resistance always delays. Living as if without tension means you stop trying to convince reality. You stop acting with an agenda. Agenda creates pressure. Pressure reveals doubt. When you truly live from the end, there is nothing to prove. Your behavior is no longer strategic, it's expressive. You act a certain way not because you're trying to get something, but because that's who you are now. There was someone who desperately wanted to be seen as confident. So they spoke louder, they took up more space, they forced certainty into every sentence. But underneath, they were monitoring themselves constantly. Did that sound confident? Did I say the right thing? Do they respect me now? That is not living from the end. That is performing toward it. Eventually, they stopped trying. Not because they gave up, but because they got tired of carrying the tension. They spoke when it felt natural. They stayed quiet when it didn't. They let moments pass without filling them, and strangely, that's when people started listening. Confidence didn't arrive through effort. It emerged through release. This is the paradox most people miss. The harder you try to live as if, the further away you are from it. Because trying implies distance. Being implies presence. Living from the end feels ordinary. That's why people overlook it. They expect fireworks, a surge of certainty, a dramatic emotional shift. But the real sign is subtle. You stop checking. You stop asking, is it working? You stop scanning reality for confirmation, not because you're suppressing the urge, but because the urge dissolves. There was a woman who wanted a healthier relationship dynamic. She learned all the right language. She practiced boundaries in her head, but every interaction still felt charged. Then one day, she stopped focusing on the relationship entirely. She focused on her internal posture. She asked herself one simple question. If this were already secure, how would I show up right now? The answer wasn't dramatic. She would respond calmly. She would not over-explain. She would not chase reassurance. So she did exactly that. Not perfectly, but consistently. At first, the other person was confused. The old dynamic tried to pull her back. But she didn't tighten. She didn't react. She stayed where she was. And eventually, the relationship reorganized. Not because she demanded it, but because she removed tension. Tension is what keeps old patterns alive. Living as if without tension requires trust. Not trust that things will work out, but trust in your position. You trust that you don't need to micromanage the process. You trust that reality will catch up without supervision. This doesn't mean passivity. It means precision. You still act, but you act from alignment, not urgency. When something feels aligned, you don't overdo it. You don't add extra emphasis. You don't second-guess the timing. You respond once, then you move on. Tension is often disguised as importance. People think, if I don't stress about this, it won't happen. But stress has never created anything stable. Stress signals lack, and lack always invites more lack. The calm version of you is not less effective. It is more accurate. It makes better decisions. It notices better opportunities. It avoids unnecessary conflict. Living as if doesn't require you to fake emotions. It requires you to stop feeding the ones that contradict your position. You don't need to force calm. You need to stop rehearsing catastrophe. You don't need to force confidence. You need to stop narrating your insecurity. This is where restraint becomes powerful. You pause instead of reacting. You choose silence instead of explanation. You let moments breathe instead of filling them. And in that space, something important happens. Life adjusts, not immediately, not loudly, but reliably. People respond differently. Situations soften, timing improves, and none of it feels shocking, because you've already been living there. The ultimate sign you're living as if without tension is this. You would be okay even if nothing changed tomorrow, not because you've given up, but because your identity is no longer on hold. You're not postponing yourself. You're not waiting to arrive. You're already standing where you decided to be. And from that place, reality has no resistance. It follows. Not because you force it, but because there is nothing left to oppose. Living as if is not something you do. It's something you stop undoing. And once you understand that, the struggle ends. Not the movement, not the growth, the struggle. Because you're no longer pulling reality forward. You're letting it catch up. There is another layer to living without tension that most people never notice. It's the ability to let things be unfinished. When you're living from the end, you don't feel the urge to close every loop immediately. You don't need instant resolution to feel secure. You can leave questions unanswered and still remain steady. That ability alone changes everything. Most tension comes from the need to control how things unfold, to manage perception, to guide outcomes step by step. But control is always rooted in fear of loss. When you trust your position, you don't cling. You don't chase clarity. You allow silence without filling it. Silence no longer feels like danger. It feels like space. And space is where reality rearranges itself. You start to notice that when you don't rush, life meets you halfway. Conversations deepen instead of escalating. Decisions become cleaner instead of complicated. Opportunities arrive without being forced. This is not coincidence, it's alignment. Living as if, without tension, also means allowing others to respond in their own time. You don't hurry them. You don't interpret delay as rejection. You trust that what belongs to your position will find you, and what doesn't will fall away without conflict. That trust creates emotional economy. You stop wasting energy on anticipation, defense, and explanation. You move through your day lighter, and when something does move, when reality finally reflects the shift you've already made, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like confirmation. Quiet, expected, almost understated. Because by the time it shows up, you've already been living there. That is the final sign that tension is gone. You don't celebrate the result. You recognize it, and then you keep going, unattached, unrushed, certain. Because once you learn how to live from the end without tension, you never go back to forcing life forward again. You let it follow. Chapter 8. The world must follow. At a certain point, something settles inside you. Not excitement, not anticipation, but certainty. It's quiet enough that you might miss it if you're still waiting for drama. But once it's there, it doesn't leave. This is the point where the world no longer feels like something you have to manage. You stop watching it closely. You stop interpreting every detail as a sign. Because you already know where you're standing. When you truly live from the end, reality doesn't feel like an opponent or a puzzle. It feels like a process unfolding at its own pace. And that's when following begins. Not because you demand it, not because you deserve it, but because alignment leaves no alternative. The world always follows the clearest signal. Not the loudest desire, not the strongest effort. The clearest position. Clarity removes negotiation. Think about someone who knows exactly who they are. They don't announce it. They don't defend it. They don't rush to prove it. They simply move, and others adjust. This adjustment doesn't always look like instant success. Sometimes it looks like space opening. Sometimes it looks like old situations dissolving. Sometimes it looks like people drifting away without conflict. This can feel unsettling if you're still attached to the past. But it's necessary. Reality cannot rearrange itself while everything stays the same. When you shift positions internally, the first thing that happens is misalignment becomes visible. Old structures strain. Old dynamics wobble. Not to punish you, but to make room. There was a man who decided to stop living in self-doubt. He didn't announce it. And he didn't make a list. He simply stopped second-guessing every choice. At first, nothing improved. In fact, some things fell apart. Conversations ended sooner. Opportunities he used to chase stopped appearing. People he once tried to please grew distant. And for a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake. But he stayed where he was. He didn't rush to replace what left. He didn't revert to old patterns to regain comfort. And slowly, something else emerged. Different conversations, different invitations, different expectations. Not louder, not flashier, more accurate. That is how the world follows. It doesn't reward you for change. It reorganizes around it. Most people never reach this stage because they retreat too soon. They confuse discomfort with failure. They mistake transition for loss. But transition is simply reality recalibrating. When you live from the end long enough, you stop fearing that process. You trust it. You understand that the world cannot reflect a new position using old pieces. So you let it rearrange. This requires restraint. You don't interfere when things go quiet. You don't panic when progress looks invisible. You don't rush to fix appearances. You stay consistent. Consistency is the language reality understands best. Not consistency of action, but consistency of being. You respond the same way whether you're being watched or not. You choose the same standards whether it's convenient or not. You stay aligned even when it would be easier to revert. And over time, the signal strengthens. Reality adjusts its timing to match your stability. This is why living from the end feels different from manifestation fantasies. There is no obsession with outcome, no emotional spikes. You are not waiting for life to surprise you. You're already there. So when something aligns, it doesn't feel like a miracle. It feels logical. Of course this happened. Of course this moved. Of course this shifted. That familiarity is the final proof. There was a woman who stopped chasing validation in her relationships. She didn't declare independence. She didn't harden. She softened inwardly. She stopped asking herself how to be chosen. She started asking herself how to remain aligned. Some relationships faded, others deepened. Eventually, she met people who didn't require explanation or effort. The dynamic felt natural. Not because she tried harder, but because she stopped compromising her position. The world didn't give her what she wanted. It matched who she became. This is the fundamental law at work. Reality doesn't ask what you desire. It asks who you are willing to be consistently. When that answer is clear, the world has no confusion. It follows, not instantly, not dramatically, but inevitably. And once you see this pattern clearly, fear loosens its grip. You stop worrying about timing. You stop worrying about losing momentum. You stop worrying about doing it right. You trust the direction because you trust your position. This trust changes how you move through daily life. You stop reacting emotionally to small fluctuations. You stop attaching meaning to every delay. You stop measuring progress every hour. You live. And life, relieved of your interference, does what it has always done best. It responds. One of the most powerful shifts at this stage is silence. You don't talk about your inner changes much. You don't explain your mindset, because explanation belongs to uncertainty. Certainty doesn't speak often, it acts. You notice that fewer words are needed, fewer justifications, fewer defenses. Your presence communicates more than your intentions ever did, and people feel it. Situations feel it. Opportunities feel it. Not consciously, but clearly. This is why the world must follow, not because it's obligated, but because it has no alternative. Alignment eliminates resistance. When who you are, how you act, and what you expect all point in the same direction, there is nothing left to contradict. And contradiction is the only thing that delays results. At this stage, patience feels natural. You don't endure waiting, you inhabit it. You know movement is happening even when you can't see it. Because you're no longer relying on sight. You're relying on position, and position never lies. Eventually, something external will shift clearly enough to be undeniable. A decision, a meeting, a message, an opportunity. And when it does, you won't feel shock, you'll feel recognition. This belongs here, because you've already been living from that end. This is where the journey completes itself. Not in fireworks, not in applause, but in quiet alignment. You don't chase life anymore. You walk beside it, and life, finally clear on who you are, walks with you. The world does not resist clarity. It organizes around it, always has, and always will. When you live from the end, fully, calmly, without tension, reality has no choice. It follows. There comes a moment when the search quiets down, not because you've found every answer, but because you've stopped asking the wrong questions. You no longer ask, when will this change? You no longer ask, what if it doesn't work? You no longer ask, am I doing this right? Those questions belong to the version of you who was waiting, and you're not waiting anymore. You've seen something important through this journey. Not as an idea, not as a technique, but as a lived understanding. You don't move life by force. You move it by position. Every chapter you listen to pointed back to the same truth from a different angle. Your life is not responding to your wishes, your effort, or your urgency. It is responding to who you are being consistent as. That realization changes everything, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You notice it in the way you speak, in the choices you make when no one is watching, in the moments where you would have once explained yourself, but now don't. You notice that you are calmer, not because life is perfect, but because your identity is no longer on hold. You are no longer postponing yourself until conditions improve. That alone is freedom. Living from the end was never about pretending the present doesn't exist. It was about understanding that the present is already old news. It is delayed feedback from a state you once occupied. And now that you've shifted that state, you don't need to rush reality. You don't need to monitor it. You don't need to manage every outcome. You let it catch up. This is where trust replaces effort. Not blind trust, not naive optimism, but grounded trust in your own position. You trust that if something aligns with who you are now, it will stay. And if it doesn't, it will leave without needing to be forced. You trust that silence is not absence, delay is not denial, and transition is not failure. You trust yourself enough to remain steady while the world rearranges. That steadiness is rare, and it is powerful. Because most people abandon their position the moment things get quiet. They rush back to old habits, old identities, old fears. Not because those things are right, but because they are familiar. You don't have to do that anymore. You know the difference now between effort and alignment, between wanting and being, between preparation and occupation. You know that when tension leaves, clarity arrives, and when clarity arrives, reality follows, not as a reward, as a response. From here forward, your work is simple, but not always easy. Your work is not to manifest harder. It is not to visualize longer. It is not to wait more patiently. Your work is to stay where you decided to stand. To notice when you're tempted to lean forward again. To notice when you feel the urge to check, to control, to explain. And instead of reacting, you return to your position. Quietly, firmly, without drama. You don't need to correct every thought. You don't need to perfect every behavior. You only need to stop contradicting yourself. Consistency of being is enough. And the more consistent you become, the less effort life requires. You'll notice that decisions simplify, those reactions soften, that timing improves without you trying to optimize it. You'll also notice that some things fall away. Old dynamics, old expectations, old versions of yourself that no longer fit. Let them go. They are not losses. They are adjustments. Reality cannot follow you into a new position while you keep holding on to the old one. As you move forward, remember this. You don't need to convince anyone of who you are. You don't need to announce your growth. You don't need to explain your calm. Alignment speaks for itself. And when the world responds, because it will, receive it without surprise, without celebration, without relief. Just recognition. Of course this shifted. Of course this aligned. Of course this arrived. Because you are already living there. That is the quiet confidence of someone who lives from the end. Not flashy, not loud, but undeniable. If you ever feel yourself slipping back into urgency, come back to this simple question. Where am I living from right now? And not where you hope to be. Not where you're trying to go. Where you are. That question will always bring you home. And finally, before you go, remember this. If this audiobook helped you see yourself more clearly, if it helped you release the need to wait, if it helped you take back your position in your own life, don't keep it to yourself. Share this with someone you care about. Someone who feels stuck. Someone who is tired of trying and ready to shift. Someone who needs to hear that they don't need to become more. They need to stand differently. Sometimes the right message reaches someone at exactly the right moment, and that moment can change everything. Live from the end. Stay there. Let reality do the rest.